You know, there are moments that make you question everything you knew about how you thought the world works. And we just had one of those moments. Earlier this week, we just had news break that Uncle Sam himself is one of the largest shareholders in Intel now. My first thought was, how is that even possible? But then, as I started doing more digging, I realized that this wasn't the first time something like this has happened. America has a history of blurring the lines between public power and private enterprise to achieve a national goal. This is a story about power, survival, and the future of American capitalism itself. This just happened. The United States government now owns almost 10% of Intel. Not a subsidy, not a bailout loan, actual equity. Uncle Sam on the cap table. And if that feels strange, that's because it is. America almost never takes ownership stakes in private companies unless it's war or crisis. So why now? To answer that, we need to rewind a century back through railroads, auto bailouts, and a department store CEO dragged from his desk by federal agents. This isn't just about Intel. It's about the rare moments when the United States decides that the market is not enough.
In the early years of a new nation, writers Benjamin Franklin and Ralph Waldo Emerson called for a literature that represented America. They were prophets of a new spirit of nationalism.
When America buys into a business, it usually does so reluctantly and temporarily. But every time it happens, it tells us something about the state of the nation. The last time we saw it, it was 2008, when the government took over 60% of General Motors. And before that, in the 1970s, it created Amtrak. Out of failing passenger rail lines. And in World War I, it ran the entire railroad system. Each intervention was born from necessity. Win a war, keep trains running, or stop the economy from total collapse. Which makes today different, because Intel isn't necessarily failing. The US is buying in for a different reason, and that's national security. So World War I was the first big break from free market orthodoxy. In 1917, railroads were clogged and chaotic. Woodrow Wilson declared them under federal control. For 2 years, the US Railroad Administration set schedules, rates, even ran the train. War ended and the railroads were handed back, but the precedent was set. In a crisis, private infrastructure could become public property. And World War II pushed that limit even further. Franklin Roosevelt seized coal mines, steel mills, and even Montgomery Ward, a national retailer, after its CEO refused to comply with wartime labor orders. And that's where the agents physically removed him from his office. These were not permanent changes, but they were extraordinary powers for extraordinary times. But let's jump back to the railroads for a second, because after the wars, the government ownership mostly disappeared until the railroads started failing again. By the late 1960s, passenger trains were hemorrhaging money. Private railroads begged to exit the business, and in 1971, Congress created Amtrak, a corporation, but one majority owned by the US government, and still is today. Then came Conrail in 1976, consolidating bankrupt freight lines into a federally owned giant. Again, the idea was temporary, and by 1987, Conrail was privatized. But Amtrak remained, because in this case, policymakers decided rail was a public good, not just a business. The next great experiment in ownership, General Motors collapsed under the weight of debt, and to save the US auto industry, the Treasury converted rescue loans into equity. 61% of the new GM belonged to the government. AIG, once the world's largest insurer, was bailed out with $180 billion, and the Fed took 79.9% stake in that. Even banks, nearly 600 of them, took government capital under TARP in the form of preferred shares and warrants. The language was careful. These were temporary, reluctant, and intended to be unwound. And they were. By 2012, AIG was back in private hands. By 2013, GM was too, though taxpayers lost about $11 billion through those transactions. But in those 5 years, America quietly looked more like France or China than like itself. Because in those other countries, this isn't strange at all. France still owns about 15% of their automaker Renault, a legacy of post-war nationalization. Germany nationalized Uniper in 2022 to keep the lights on during the energy crisis. And in China, state ownership isn't the exception, it's the rule. A majority of its Fortune 500 companies are state-owned enterprises. And America has always painted this as the difference here. The government regulates but doesn't own except when it does. So why is the US a shareholder of Intel today? That's because these semiconductors are no longer just products, they're infrastructures. systems. They power iPhones, data centers, fighter jets, and 70% of them are made in East Asia, especially in Taiwan, a new flashpoint in this potentially upcoming war. And the logic is twofold. If taxpayers are bankrolling the fabrications regardless, they should share in the upside. And if Intel is too important to fail, the government is making that explicit. So it's really not about rescuing a failing firm, it's about anchoring an industry, which makes Intel's case unique because it's not wartime nationalization, it's not crisis rescue, it's something new. And that's strategic capitalism, a system where markets still drive most of the money, but the government buys in when the sector is too critical to risk. It's a step toward the way other countries handle national champions. Not socialism, not laissez-faire, something in between. So the United States has only bought into private companies a handful of times in history. Each time it marked a turning point: railroads in wartime, automakers in crisis, and now microchips in an era of geopolitical rivalry. So when you hear that the US owns 10% of Intel, don't think about one company, think about the bigger story, the rare moments when America decides that capitalism alone isn't enough. Thank you so much for listening to my take on this situation. If you want more business and cultural investigative content, go ahead and follow me on Instagram at MaxXRosenblum. It's linked in my YouTube bio. And as always, have a fantastic week, and I'll see you next time.